Hi, I'm Arun George, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In today's episode, we're looking at pharmaceutical firm Moderna applying for emergency authorization for its COVID 19 vaccine. But first, we're decoding the latest gross domestic product or GDP statistics that were released late last week. On Friday, the Indian government announced that the country's economic activity had contracted by 7.5% during the second quarter of this financial year. The announcement was met with a fair bit of cheer. Coming after a quarter in which India registered its worst ever economic growth on record, there was suddenly hope that the Indian economy was getting back on track. To understand the latest economic growth numbers, we're now speaking with Udit Misra, who writes on economy and finance for the Indian Express. Udit has decoded the GDP numbers in his latest Explain Speaking newsletter, which you can sign up for on the website. Now, back to Udit. Udit, could you explain what are the factors that saw the GDP go from minus 23.9% to minus 7.5%?
Right. To understand the sectoral variations, it is good to look at the gross value added data within the GDP press release. Gross value added is basically looking at the same national income accounting, but from the perspective of the productive sectors, the different sectors of the economy, and how much are they producing or earning. So, looking at from the supply side. Now, if you look at the gross value added data, the economy is divided into 8 sectors. And what we find is that, as against just one sector registering a positive growth in the first quarter, which was agriculture, in quarter two, we have 3 sectors. Apart from agriculture, we also have manufacturing, which registered a minor growth. And the third sector is electricity and gas and water supply and other such utilities, which have grown by 4.4%. So, as against just one sector growing in the first quarter, now we have 3 sectors out of 8 which are registering positive growth, which basically means that these 3 sectors saw a growth over and above what was produced in the same quarter, that is July, August, September in last financial year. So we are decidedly on the positive territory. And apart from these 3, the other 5 sectors also, we find that in other 5, 3 sectors are such where the rate of contraction has decelerated. So, which is to say that the economy seems to be on a mend. These include the construction sector, which saw a massive contraction over 50% in first quarter. This time around, the contraction is there, but it's only around 8.6%. Which sort of shows that, there are sectors which are contracting, but contracting at a slower pace, and maybe in a couple of quarters, things will come back to a fairly normal rate. So what we are seeing is fairly similar to what the RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das had said some time back, that there are different sectors of the economy which will recover at different rates. And that is what we are seeing. Agriculture has been the most robust. It has been growing happily, even though we have fair amount of farm unrest right now, largely coming from Punjab and Haryana. But overall, agriculture has been the sector to beat, essentially, doing well. The big news this time amongst all sectors was manufacturing, which contracted almost 40% in the first quarter, but registered a minor growth of 0.6% this quarter. And this has led to a lot of discussion amongst people because nobody is very clear how manufacturing has shown a positive growth. But that is what the data is showing. There is a possibility that it may be revised upwards or downwards later on because data is also a massive casualty during COVID times. But for what it's worth, right now, agriculture, manufacturing, and many of these utilities like electricity, gas, water supply are the ones that are pushing up the economy. Many other sectors are sort of at least not hurting the economy as much as they were doing in the first quarter.
So, since the numbers were announced on Friday, some organizations have then revised their estimates for India's economic growth, saying that it could grow more than expected at the beginning of this year, maybe. When India's GDP goes from a contraction of 23.9 to 7.5, is that reason for cheer, but?
So this is really very representative of our times right now. The kind of economic stress is so severe that even when the economy is sort of contracting by 7.5%, there is a massive cheer. But it is not without reason. Most people expected the economy to contract by a little more than 7.5. We know that just last month, RBI had said that the economy could contract by 8.6% in the second quarter. Most other estimates in the private sector, the economists there were expecting somewhere around 9, even some were expecting 10% contraction. So from that measure, the contraction of 7.5 is a positive surprise, and it shows that the economy is recovering faster than what many others thought it would. There is also a certain sentiment. Now, this is not a data I have verified, but the State Bank of India research team pulled out a data which said that as against the first quarter, where India was one of the most battered and bruised economies in the world among the major economies, for the second quarter of this financial year, if we look at the GDP data of some 49 countries that have declared that data, India's GDP decline of 7.5 is lower than the average GDP decline of those 49 countries, which is around 12.5%. So we have moved from being the most battered and bruised ones to the less battered and bruised ones in the second quarter. So that's again another reason for cheer, that perhaps the economy is surprising us on the positive side.
So, what remain matters of concern in this, relative reduction in economic contraction?
Well, the fact remains that we are still contracting. I mean, that nobody can deny. And frankly, as I mentioned, barring agriculture and some utilities like electricity and water, which are growing at sort of a reasonable rate, even manufacturing is just a marginal increase of 0.6%. And it's fairly questionable because all the other data which sort of correlates heavily with manufacturing, for example, the index of industrial production, for the same period is actually down. So there is a big question mark whether this 0.6% is really genuine or not, or how robust is it. There is also concern about, there are sectors like financial, real estate, and professional services, all kinds of services that you might imagine making use of, or even the public administration sector, defense, the government value addition. Their contraction has actually increased. For example, the sectors of real estate or other such professional services or financial services, whereas banking and stuff, they have actually contracted far more. First quarter they contracted by over 5%. Now they're contracting by over 8%. So there are genuine concern there. And even the other sectors like construction, where as I said, it's contracting by around 9 odd percent, when in the first quarter it was contracting by 50%. The fact remains that it is still contracting, and there is no guarantee here that the deceleration in contraction will necessarily result in a positive growth in the second or the third quarter. It is entirely possible that the process slows down if there's another round of COVID, another wave of COVID, or it depends on a lot of factors. So there are a lot of caveats still in terms of the fact that there are many factors that will finally determine whether India is able to dig itself out of this hole.
Also, and we've spoken in the past about this, and you've spoken of how there are two major factors that will decide how economic growth goes from here on. One is the government, which will spend money, and the second is the RBI, which will make that money available. RBI has so far maintained an accommodative stance, but hasn't reduced rates beyond a point, saying that inflation is still too high. I mean, does this contraction or this sort of rise in growth, in a sense, make it more likely that the RBI is going to ease interest rates?
So the odd thing with this smarter than expected recovery is that it almost now is certain that RBI will not cut interest rates, because see, in the last 2-3 meetings, RBI has been really bothered with the sustained increase in inflation rate, and the inflation rate has been really persistent and high. And RBI, even when the growth was plummeting through the floor, was not cutting interest rates beyond a point because it was concerned about inflation. Now, this data shows that growth concerns are perhaps not as exaggerated or not as serious as they were before this data was made available, which is to say that the push for cutting interest rates perhaps would be less. So all the more one would expect that RBI, when it decides on December 4th about the monetary policy, is perhaps not likely to cut interest rates. So we are likely to stay with the same policy and move into the next year and see whether inflation rate by that time subsides.
We'll be back with Udit after this quick break. Before we get to the next segment, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say that they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there's perhaps no other place that does this better than the Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of the newspaper, you know how useful the Explain section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log into indianexpress.com/explained and access their coverage 24/7. Explained by the Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. We're back with Udit, who's helping us make sense of the latest gross domestic product or GDP numbers and what it says about the Indian economy. Udit, you've also written about how this year's economic growth could have a spillover effect on the budget that will come in March. Could you explain how and what its effect would be on average consumers?
So, see, the budget exercise, which is already underway for the next financial year, essentially starts with an understanding or an assumption about the nominal GDP. Now, nominal GDP is GDP calculated over current prices as against the real GDP, which we have been discussing. Nominal GDP is the observed variable. When the budget makes an assumption on nominal GDP, it then starts with that assumption and draws all its calculations related to nominal GDP. So if nominal GDP is supposed to grow by 10%, then you can expect taxes to grow at some fraction of that growth. And similarly, your expenditures and your deficits, all the numbers are related to the assumptions about nominal GDP. And what we've seen in the last 2 years, essentially, is that the finance ministry has got the nominal GDP calculation quite wrong. Partly it had to do with the fact that the economy was slowing down, but partly it also had to do with their not accepting or not correctly understanding how fast the economy was decelerating even before COVID. So it is very crucial for the finance ministry to look at the nominal GDP data, which is, in nominal GDP terms, we are contracting only by 4% in the second quarter. So it is possible that we'd be growing at a positive rate by the end of the year. And that number, whatever that assumption about nominal GDP is going to be crucial for the next year's budget numbers and the credibility of those budget numbers, because this quarterly GDP is the last quarterly GDP number that we'll see before the budget is presented on the 1st of February. So this is the time when they are fixing all the numbers for the next financial year. And if they get the numbers wrong, then all your policy making, your all the budget allocation, which is essentially money being put to different policies, will go awry. And we've already had 2 years of that thing happening. We do not definitely want it to happen for the third consecutive year. So that is a crucial thing. With growth surprising us on the positive side, the challenge for finance ministry would be now to correctly ascertain what is the likely nominal GDP growth for the next financial year.
So, does that mean then that the government, if it gets that numbering wrong, does it mean it says allocates too little for something or too much? Could you explain how it directly affects things?
Yes, exactly. So the budget making exercise, you base it on what your projected revenues would be. You base your projected revenues on your nominal GDP growth. Now, if you get that basic number wrong, then your revenues would be awry, and then you will not have the same amount of funds that you thought you would be spending. And then once you do not have the same amount of funds, you're not sure whether when you allocated X amount to one policy and Y amount to another policy, whether you will be able to give that money. When you're not able to give that money, your projections of what would happen to growth and the next round of development will also get derailed. So it's like a domino effect. So if you do not set your assumptions about nominal GDP growth in the next financial year based on what your nominal GDP growth is in this financial year, if you do not get that right, then all your spending parameters, which is what the whole budget exercise is about, saying this is our government, this is what we want to spend on, these are our priorities, so we'll spend more on this and less on that, and this is the kind of growth we want, all of that whole exercise gets derailed. We've seen that last year when, at the start of the 2019 2020 year, when in July, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitaram presented her budget, she expected a nominal GDP growth of 12%, 12 to 12.5%. We ended that, and by that measure, she expected that the real GDP growth would be close to 8%, 8.5%. What happened was that we ended the year with a real GDP growth of just 4%. And that was just half of what was initially expected. And that happened because the nominal GDP didn't grow at 12 or 12.5, it grew at 8 or 8.5. So because you got the original number wrong, all your numbers went off. And then all this discussion that we have, all the policy analysis that we do, it's all based on those budget numbers. Now, if you got the fundamental number wrong, then it really vitiates any kind of analysis. It undermines even a chance to understand what is going wrong, because you've got all your numbers wrong all over the place. So that is why nominal GDP is a crucial assessment. And that is why we must get it right for next year, so that the recovery process is more predictable. We have a clear handle on what we need to do.
Pharmaceutical firm Moderna said that it is seeking emergency authorization in the US and Europe for its COVID-19 vaccine. The company said that the full results from its late-stage study showed that its vaccine candidate was 94.1% effective and has no serious safety concerns. Moderna said its vaccine's efficacy rate was consistent across age, race, ethnicity, and gender demographics. The company also said that its candidate had a 100% success rate in preventing severe cases. If approved, Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine would be the second vaccine candidate after Pfizer's to get emergency authorization. We had discussed the Moderna vaccine and its potential use in India in an early episode, and that's provided in the description of today's episode. In India, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine candidate is being closely watched. That vaccine ran into some controversy over the weekend. One person who is participating in the trials of the vaccine, called Covishield in India, claimed he suffered an extreme adverse reaction to the vaccine. He sought 5 crore rupees in compensation. Serum Institute of India, which is conducting the trials in India, said that the allegations made by the man were malicious. The firm said that the medical conditions described by the man were not linked to the vaccine trial, and that he was falsely blaming the vaccine trials for them. An official conducting the trials told the Indian Express that they had informed authorities about the man's medical condition. Serum has said it will seek in excess of 100 crore rupees in damages from the man. You were listening to The Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Arun George, and as always, was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explained page. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.